Yeah, you seem to have more books even than I do. I've been to Iran twice now. Once at a time when Renaz was there also at the Faj Film Festival. And that was trying to think what year that was. It was in the late 90s. Is that right, Renaz? Do you remember?
I know that you were in the jury in 2001.
Oh, that would have been okay. So that was when I was, yes. And then much more recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was commissioned to teach a course at a state film school in Tehran, a school that I'm sorry to say no longer exists partly because of the sanctions they had to close. But it was a very interesting setup where I had at least 25 or 30 students, and they all had to be tested for their proficiency not only in English but also in film history in order to get into the course. And it was done with translation, but also with people who knew some English. And it was a week-long course in film criticism where it even involved them writing some film criticism and then translating their own pieces from Farsi to English and so on. It was a very interesting and gratifying experience, actually. But my interest in Iranian cinema, well, it comes partly from being guided by Murnaz, but also I was lucky enough to attend the Locarno Film Festival for a few days when Kiarostami was there, and I got to see some of the first films that I saw by him. And then shortly afterwards, I was at the Toronto Film Festival, where he also was there. And Murnaz had worked for him when she was, working as a filmmaker. So they had a kind of reunion. Maybe you could talk about that, Murnaz. And on that occasion, I had a chance to see a couple of more films of his. And so the first Iranian film I ever saw, however, by luck, was one of the most important films of the first Iranian New Wave when I was living in London in the mid-1970s. I actually was able to see a film called The Mongols, which is quite an extraordinary, it actually can be described as a post-Godardian Iranian film. Very hard to see nowadays, unfortunately, but one of the most remarkable films from Iran, from any period. And I also, at the same time that I saw the film, as it happened, was sharing a flat with a few people, one of whom was an Iranian woman. And Murnaz was actually, we were both in London at the same time, but we didn't know each other. We didn't meet until years later in Chicago. But Murnaz actually knew my roommate. So we had a kind of funny connection many years before we ever met.
سلام. من وقتی که آمدم شیکاگو، یعنی آمدم آمریکا 1984 به میلادی، ولی اون موقع یه مدت طول کشید تا اینجا کارگیر آوردم تو دانشگاه اینا. بعد به فیلم سنتر شیکاگو که هر ماه فیلم‌های یک کشور بخصوصی رو نشون میدن. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to talk to you in English. Sorry, Jonathan. You don't know Farsi. I forgot. Okay. In 1989, I proposed to the Chicago Film Center where they would they had a showcase of different countries each month. So I offered them to have a screening of Iranian films. At that time, the Iranian films were not so well known in the United States. And this was 1988, 1989, end of Iran-Iraq War, 1988. So it took a while until 1989, they said, okay, if you do all the work, collect the film, get the filmmaker, write about it, okay. And so it started. Then I heard in 1992 that 18 Iranian films were Toronto Film Festival. So I went to Toronto to see those films. The first film of Makhmalov, I got The Peddler from the Farabi people who were there and a couple of other films. So gradually we started a relationship with Farabi, and later I went to Iran several times, and also took Barbara, who was the director of the film center, with me. Although I could have the Iranian Film Festival at Columbia College because they would give me all the office and all the, I did not want to, I wanted an American institution which was known for showing different national cinema to pick up Iranian cinema. So that's why I took Barbara with me. So she got to meet all the people in Iran, and we went there 3 times together, twice together. And then then I stopped going there and she just went there. So that's how we got, facilitated, all these getting Iranian films in Film Center, which was a plus because the films, I know that, you're going to ask Jonathan, what's his impression of Iran based on Iranian films that he sees. The Iranian films that Jonathan sees and a lot of other critics or film lovers or general public in the US or Canada or maybe even Western Europe, I don't know about Europe so much, see is the festival films, film that get to festival. But Film Center would show, 10 to 15 films from Iran that were not festival, so-called festival films, and films were, important films. So we got, a lot of other people, invited here and with their films. So that's a kind of exposure that not many Americans or many film critics are exposed to.
I moved to Chicago to be a film critic on an alternative newspaper, the Chicago Reader, in 1987. So it was about a year before I met Murnaz. And but prior to, meeting Murnaz and going to festivals that had Iranian films, the only Iranian film I'd ever seen was The Mongols back in the mid-'70s in London. I hadn't had any exposure to Iranian films before that. And I lived in a lot of different places. I mean, I lived in Paris before I lived in London, New York before that. And then I'd been living on the West Coast for a while before I came to Chicago.
Yeah, and I think that when Jonathan and I sort of decided to take the House is Black and get it restored and get it subtitled. And we did the basic subtitle, and then we gave it to people like Farzaneh Milani, who is a professor of literature and specialty in Furugh Farrokhzad. So anyway, so when the film got the subtitle in English was done, and it was shown in New York Film Festival, that was something that really drew a lot of attention, also of many American critics and American public.
I was on the selection committee of the New York Film Festival at that time. We were able to get The House is Black shown at the festival with Taste of Cherry, actually.
You remember, Jonathan, in Toronto, you also saw Reza Mirkarimi film, The Letter of a Soldier.
The Child and the Soldier.
The Child and the Soldier.
Yes,
you like that film.
That's true, right? I was getting acquainted with some other films then too, and of course, this was probably around the same period as The White Balloon, maybe, of Panahi. And Panahi was actually a former student of Murnaz's in Tehran. That she had him as a student.
Long time ago. Yeah.
In the case of, certainly with Kiarostami, let me kind of give you at least what my reasoning was. I feel that during a large part of the 60s, Godard had a function, Jean-Luc Godard, of his films being like a global newspaper, that you would go to his films to almost like get a sense of what was going on in the world. That you got a very strong sense of that from Godard, because his films were open to so many things that were happening at that time, and are happening in the world. But that's because, in a way, in the 60s, what was happening in the world could be experienced through what was happening in big cities, which of course where Godard was. Kiarostami, by contrast, even though some of his films might be set in Tehran, a good many of them were set in very remote areas, um, far away from everything that we know of as, sort of like urban culture. But at the same time, that it struck me as what was happening in the world, all over the world, was more easily perceivable in what's known as the sticks in rural areas. And why? Because the same big companies all over the world were doing the same things. So that in the Wind Will Carry Us, you have, the installation of some kind of, antenna for TV or something like that that was being installed. Uh, and you have mobile phones. There's all sorts of things that come out in his films that seemed to me that was very indicative of what was happening in the world. And that this was something that that the kind of way of finding out what was happening in the world had shifted. And I don't know that it was necessarily something that either Godard or Kiarostami were consciously interested in doing. It was just something that I think they were open to outside influences of all kinds. And that's why, in a sense, their films became kind of like global newspapers. But a difference between Renaz and me when we wrote our book together on Kiarostami was that she saw him mainly as an Iranian filmmaker, whereas I tended to see him much more, as I say, as a kind of global filmmaker, and that this was a large part of my interest. That you could go to Kiarostami films to get a sense of what was happening in the world. And of course, this became even more pronounced once he started making films outside of Iran in Certified Copy and in Like Someone in Love, his last two fiction features. I think there was a kind of puzzlement that accompanied his films throughout his career. And it's understandable because, I mean, he's somebody who very much played against expectations. I mean, what was sort of incredible was he was such a good illusionist that he had all sorts of ways of fooling the audience, and people didn't even realize, for example, the fact that the characters who the hero meets in Taste of Cherry were not even, that the two characters were not even in the same space or being filmed together. They were being filmed separately. Kiarostami was a master of what we might even call Hollywood illusionism, but most people didn't realize this. So I think there was a lot of, there was also a resistance to some of Kiarostami's films in a very unsophisticated way. Like, for example, David Denby almost refused to take Kiarostami's films seriously until he cast Juliette Binoche in like Certified Copy, and then he became interested. It was almost as if, that the minute there was a Western actor in his films, you could take them seriously. Whereas before, the common approach of a lot of American critics towards Kiarostami was to see him as some sort of, later development of neorealism, so that he was like Satyajit Roy, or he was like, I don't know, Italian neorealism, Rossellini, and they only saw him that way. They didn't see him as a person who was playing all kinds of tricks with the cinematic apparatus. So I think that there was a misunderstanding, and a misunderstanding that actually came from that the way you supposedly approach so-called third world cinema is that you see it always in terms of some kind of sociology, that you don't see it in terms of a sophisticated engagement with the medium of cinema, but you see it as for content, and the content is the way poor people live. And of course, a lot of Iranian people would say, why are you Americans so interested in Iranian films that are all about poor people? Iran is not made up of more than poor people or middle-class people and rich people too. And I said, well, maybe there are too many poor people in the Iranian films that I see, but there are too many, in the Hollywood films that you see, there are too many rich people. So you're getting a distorted view of America also.
They wanted to see Kiarostami in the context of Iran. So once he was out of his element, meaning that making films in the West, that it was a resistance towards that, because they wanted to see him, what he's showing of Iran, what he's doing within the context of Iran. That's always important. I think, I don't know what Jonathan thinks, but all the attitude of festival programmers here, film critics in North America and Canada, is that when they see a film from Iran, it's always in the context of Iran. It's never separate. The aesthetic of the film is never the judgment of the aesthetic of the film. It's the same is true with our friend Asghar Farhadi. His films is not just it's always within the context of Iran. So once a filmmaker outside of Iran makes a film, they don't know how to deal with it, because they don't, filmmaker from Middle East, in the United States, they don't, quite settle here. They cannot merge with the system. So they don't know how to sort of react to the film. It's so as Jonathan said, so the elements of Western culture should be in the film, like Pinochet should be there, or some, or the landscape, or some kind of interaction with daily life or something of the Western world in the film. Otherwise, it's hard to see a film without.
Yes, but I think if people knew a little bit more about Iran, about the conventions of Iranian cinema, they could have seen that some of the same so-called Iranian characteristics were carried over into other films. For instance, the fact that most Iranian films are set in exteriors rather than interiors had to do with the censorship laws, because you couldn't show women indoors unless they were wearing, this headgear. And therefore, a lot of the films were set outdoors. Well, Certified Copy is set mainly outdoors, even though it's in Italy. And that's because Kiarostami got into the habit, I think, of filming outdoors and liked doing it in a certain way. And he also liked filming in cars a lot. And so there are a lot of characteristics that are still carried over. And even the kind of tricks with illusionism and so on that I alluded to before. But I think there's always a disadvantage, because, one of the funny things about, it seems to me, about American culture is that during the Cold War, even though there was a constant sort of like sense of hostility towards the communist world and Russia and so on, there was still a kind of engagement with the outside world. Whereas if you look at contemporary films that depict in America that depict the outside world, what's amazing is the cliched images you get of other countries are still the same cliched images that existed in the 1950s. They haven't, because America has been so closed off. And this is really paradoxical, because we have the internet now. So we have all kinds of means of sort of engaging with the world outside. And yet America has become more isolated, more isolationist in a certain way than it was even during the Cold War. And, you can see this in, like, for example, to give you an example of what I mean, in the 1950s, whenever they had to show Russia, they would show somebody like Khrushchev taking off his shoe and hitting it on a table. It was like a cartoon idea of, that came from Khrushchev. But you really don't have any sort of like further developments of that in contemporary films. It's like, and that's what's really strange, that America has becoming more isolated than it was during the Cold War. And I don't really know the reasons for this entirely. It would seem to me that trade has something to do with it, but I don't really know. It's more than just that. And the fact that America, and also one has to say that, seeing Iranian films gives one some certain ideas about Iranian culture, but it's an imperfect kind of lens, because they're because of censorship and for other reasons too. There are only certain things that come across in the films and some things don't. So it's just that for me, it was a kind of beginning of understanding, certain things about Iranian culture through the films. But as I say, it becomes an imperfect lens also. I suppose there was that, although he was often criticized for not being more critical, which seemed to me a kind of you know, an easy shot to take because no, they didn't really have any sense when they were making this criticism often of the kind of difficulties he was working against. I mean, there were certain periods in the history of Iranian cinema when it was illegal to have close-ups of, I don't know if it was just of women or close-ups of anybody. So, I mean, there were all kinds of constraints, just like in Hollywood cinema, a lot of its characteristics, like during the 30s and 40s when it was illegal to show even a husband and wife in bed in the same bed at the same time. One of them had to have one of their feet on the floor and so on. I mean, just crazy rules that often wound up dictating the content of the films. I think what you say is interesting about Kiarostami, but one thing that's also that complicates this is that people sometimes have a distorted idea of who is religious and who's an atheist and who isn't. Like most people perceive Carl Dreyer as a religious filmmaker, when people who actually, it's hard, the most reliable biographies that we have tell us that Dreyer wasn't religious at all. He was interested in religious subjects, but he wasn't a religious person himself. That when he went to church, it was a French church and he went in order to learn French, but it wasn't because he was religious. And it's even complicated with Bresson because Bresson, it now seems, was religious in a certain way, but there's certain ways that you could read his films as being almost atheistic, particularly his late films. So it becomes very complicated. And sometimes the whole meaning that people derive are based on assumptions about the filmmaker's religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs when we don't have a solid basis for knowing what those beliefs are. And so it becomes a very complicated question. I think what you're saying about Tarkovsky makes a lot of sense, though, that his religion was partly what led to his problems with censorship in a certain way, I would suspect. And it is interesting that Bresson, back in the 60s, when I saw my first Bresson film, I think the first one was Pickpocket, was considered so extreme and eccentric that he was treated like as a joke, even by people who liked his films. And by the time he died, he had become so popular that a traveling retrospective in North America was so successful that it got repeated in a lot of places because there were screenings of his films that were, like it was sold out and had standing room only. And I think suddenly people became attracted to the idea of what they saw as this spiritual. And the same thing, that happened gradually with Tarkovsky. And it had a lot to do with seeing films publicly on a big screen as opposed to, even though I guess that got carried over into watching things at home and on video. So it's very interesting if you see the kind of changes in the perception of people. I mean, Murnaz could talk about this because her favorite filmmaker when she was at film school in London, I think, was when she discovered Bresson. But at the time, Bresson was not taken seriously in Iran at all. And she wrote the first article in a film magazine defending him. Whereas today, he's considered a major filmmaker in Iran. And I found it interesting when I was teaching my course just a few years ago. The most popular filmmaker I showed was Bela Tarr, someone who's considered totally esoteric and also, in a funny sort of way, even though his films are atheistic, they're also spiritual. And it seems to me that there's a reason why Iranians now like Bresson because Bresson's films could also be described thematically as being about souls and hiding. And that's very much, it seems to be about the conditions of living under Islamic laws in Iran. Means that that's a condition that I think Iranian people are very familiar with.
I think there's a distinction between religious film or a spiritual film or whatever. You know, a filmmaker, we don't know many filmmakers or their personal convictions, but a film that, you know, is maybe informed by somebody's conviction or their worldview or their, you know, spirituality or whatever you want to call it. To me, the film would do something in the film that takes away our attention from the story to something higher, to something off a screen. That maybe we call it poetry, we may call it a spiritual film, they call it transcendental film, but we are not so much in the action and the plot of the film. We are given, you know, we are invited to a, you know, that's why Bresson film, I liked it because, not because he was, you know, I didn't know at the time, you know, his religion or anything, but because, you know, he was referring to things that are bigger than the screen. That one doesn't have a word for it, but you know that aspect of his cinema that it suppresses acting, it suppresses the plot, it suppresses all the show business of cinema in favor of something else. That appealed to me, and Tarkovsky.
I think what you're saying is true, though, but at the same time, there's a paradox because what you're describing is kind of like what Paul Schrader describes when he wrote his, you know, master's thesis, and which became a book called Transcendental Style in Film. But at the same time, what attracted me to Bresson was a certain materialism, that he was a very erotic filmmaker, and that the actual material surfaces of things, of bodies, of sounds, of nature, all these sort of things were very vivid in Bresson's films. So it was, but it was still something apart that was separate from the story. And so it wasn't necessarily higher. Well, it was different. In other words, it was a different realm from plot. And the same thing, of course, is true to some extent in Dreyer, too. That there's a kind of eroticism in his films as well. So it's a complicated question of what we call that extra thing, whether it's transcendental or whether it's material, because those are almost opposite ideas, and yet we can find both of them in films by Bresson and Dreyer.
Well, there's no separation from body and soul. You know, the thing is that that's the body is all we have, and that's how we are experiencing things. So, attention to sound and you know, senses in the film is very important. But that's our antenna. You know, we receive, and you know, anyway, I don't want to get it. Sorry.
Anyway, I think it becomes an interesting question because there are, you know, like still debates involving, and you know, all filmmakers who have a sort of, let's say, a so-called spiritual dimension. I mean, in Tarkovsky too. Because if you look at I mean, one thing that's to me problematic about a lot of Tarkovsky's films is that they're very misogynistic, which I don't think is true of Bresson's films or Dreyer's films. On the contrary, it seems to me Bresson's and Dreyer's are closer to being feminist in some way, but not Tarkovsky's. When in Tarkovsky's last film, a man could burn down his house, and what this means for the wife and children who live there is not even examined or considered worth considering. It's just his soul that's an issue, you know? It's not the soul of the other members of his family. I mean, to give an example of why I consider some of his films misogynistic. Well, one thing that's complicated is that the art films in both of these countries are largely exist for export. They have a very limited audience in their home countries. I mean, after I think Close Up, or maybe it was one other film, almost none of the features of Kiarostami showed commercially in Iran. And one reason why he was resented in Iran is they felt that, you know, his films were made for export. They weren't made for Iranian people. I'm less knowledgeable about the situation in Chinese films, but it does seem to me that there was a way in which a lot of film culture in China is based on piracy and people buying things on video. And that's true in Iran also, that most films that people see are films purchased from dealers on video, including American films. And that's what the film culture is, rather than, you know, like what gets shown in theaters to a certain extent. So that becomes kind of complicated, that the idea of art cinema is, again, not entirely for export, but more for export than for, you know, people of the same country. I mean, Makhmalbaf is an interesting figure because he definitely had a very pronounced Iranian following. But at the same time, he eventually had to go, you know, his own politics changed. I mean, he started out as a fundamentalist and he wound up as a kind of anti-fundamentalist radical. So he had, and in fact, he and his family both had to leave Iran. And the films that he makes nowadays probably don't show in Iran at all. So yes, and of course, there's also a kind of confusion that still exists about his films by his family members, because, you know, there are a lot of them are perceived to be films by them and not by him. But at the same time, the scripts are often by him. He's the producer, and so there's a certain way in which they're kind of his films also. And there's a kind of hocus pocus going on as to what extent they really are, you know, because a lot of people took his daughter Samira's films very seriously, and yet she recently got married and you know, for a long time has given up filmmaking, and it doesn't really seem like that those films that are praised as being hers might actually be his more than hers. And you get some sense of this in one of the films made by Hannah, a younger daughter of his, which was about the filming of one of Samira's films. When you get a sense of him turning up for all the shootings and making suggestions and things like this. So it becomes a little bit complicated, just how we perceive those films. I mean, it's different with each filmmaker, but it is significant that you know, Kiarostami was almost the only major figure who wasn't driven into exile, at least from the so-called first Iranian New Wave. But if he continued making films, one almost feels like he was moving in that direction, because so many of his last films were not made in Iran or made partly outside of Iran. And it seems like he was becoming more and more estranged from, in various ways, from Iranian culture. So it's hard, you know, it's impossible to speculate, but it did seem like he was moving in that direction, even when it came to making a film like ABC Africa, you know, which is actually the first film he made outside of Iran.
But Jonathan, you know, Farhadi is very good storyteller. And his cinema is, although it has many, you know, artistic value, but he's also very close to commercial cinema. While, you know, Kiarostami has a very, you know, age of experimental cinema in his films, in his work. So he said, you know, what he's saying, you know, like his film Shirin, for example, you know, or even, you know, The Wind Will Carry Us. I saw the film with the audience in Tehran, and I saw how people were reacting to the film. So there's an experimental aspect of or against cinema, counter cinema in Kiarostami's films. That aspect does not exist in Farhadi's film. He's a very good director in, you know, narrative fictional films. Yeah, that's I think that's very accessible. He's very accessible, Farhadi.
And of course, that inflects the way he deals with particular Iranian issues involving, which at least are more obviously present, it seems to me, in Farhadi's films than in Kiarostami's also. One of the things that I think we have to say, in order to really understand what's going on in cinema today, we have to kind of like show a certain skepticism towards some of the way certain things are read, that there's a certain kind of PC ideology that rules a lot of discourse about cinema now, to such a degree that there are certain things that we're not even allowed to pay attention to and to see, that we are circumscribed, and it's a kind of censorship, unofficial censorship, but one that can be just as determining and just as powerful as the kind imposed by the state. And that limits the way we see some of these films also, it seems to me. Well, I think we have to recognize, for instance, that it's not simply either or, like either it's Roger or, but it's a certain kind of mechanism that governs everything. For instance, not many people were aware of the fact that Roger Ebert's TV show with Gene Siskel was produced by the Disney studio. Now, what did that mean? It meant that they didn't have to like every film that was released by the Disney studio, but they did have to review every film that was released by the Disney studio, which was not true of films from any other studio. So they were giving publicity to all these Disney releases, which meant that it wasn't entirely just sort of like disinterested criticism. It was also promotion for the Disney studio. And that's sort of like, I'm currently preparing to do an audio commentary next week with a friend of mine on Citizen Kane for a new edition that Criterion is bringing out. And, an awful lot is determined in the way one treats Citizen Kane as whether one considers it a Hollywood film or an independent film that uses Hollywood equipment. It's a radical difference, and it seems like the first several years when Citizen Kane came out, it met with a kind of bewildered response because people didn't know how to treat it. It's like they didn't see it. And then Pauline Kael came along and said it's just another Hollywood newspaper comedy. And that's the way it's seen now, as a classic along with Wizard of Oz and Casablanca. And, but that's because of the change that took place. Before and in a way it domesticates the film and makes it less threatening if it becomes a Hollywood film. So it seems to me there are all these ideological factors at play in what we consider, a commercial movie or a good movie or a bad movie. I mean, the Oscars and the Academy Awards are a form of publicity, but people don't see it as publicity. They see it as a form of canonizing, and criticism even. So I think that's the apparatus, the Hollywood, the commercial studio apparatus that dictates film culture much more than critics do, because they limit if they refuse to show a film to the critics can't see it and they can't review it. So they kind of tend to dominate the field to a large extent. And when I used to be a professional reviewer for the Chicago Reader, I would get regular letters, people saying, "Why are you always writing about films I've never heard of?" What they really meant without saying that is, why are you reviewing films that don't have multi-million-dollar ad campaigns? Because if they don't have multi-million-dollar ad campaigns, chances are you won't hear them. And those are considered the only films of importance. Therefore, if you go to almost any country in the world that has a film institute, like the British Film Institute, their usual job of them is to sort of like preserve films from all over the world, but not the American Film Institute. The American Film Institute is only interested in preserving American films and studio films. Because, for instance, when they did a survey among critics and filmmakers of what are the greatest films, and they sent out, lists of possibilities. They didn't even consider films that were non-studio. So, for example, there were no films by John Cassavetes. There were almost no films by Charlie Chaplin because these were independent filmmakers. What was it? For instance, I mean, when they did a poll on the greatest American comedies, there were hundreds and hundreds of candidates that were on the list, but not Monsieur Verdoux, which some people consider Chaplin's greatest film. It wasn't even on the list. Why? Because it was an independent film. It wasn't a studio film. So there's all kinds of determining factors that people are not aware of, but which still determine what films they see, what they think of them, all sorts of things like that. And I also have a feeling that one of the reasons why Farhadi, even though he's a talent, he's a very good storyteller, but one reason why he got his first Oscar, it seems to me, and why the same film did really big box office in Israel, for example, is that there are a lot of people who didn't want to go to war with Iran. And it seems to me their way of expressing that they didn't want to go to war with Iran was to, if they were in the Academy, was voting for his film, an Iranian film. I actually think that had a lot to do with it. That it didn't have a lot to do with sort of like basically saying this is a better film than that, than such and such, but simply the emotional thing is I would rather not, my country not go to war with Iran, Well, it had been largely ignored because even though it won a prize at a German short film festival in Oberhausen, it was, some people knew about it. I mean, Chris Marker actually befriended Farouk Farzad and knew about the House is Black, but most people didn't. It's true. It was a very much a delayed kind of thing. And I discovered the film, interestingly enough, the same time I discovered Kurostami at Locarno, because I saw it without subtitles, but I already could tell it was a great film without even understanding what was in it. And Kurostami was in the audience seeing it, just sitting 2 rows in front of me, So I think it's sometimes people are culturally ready for something and sometimes they aren't. And I don't know if there are probably a lot of different factors because according to Golistan, the producer, the film had been subtitled and shown, back when it was around the time it was made, even in the United States. But if so, nobody paid any attention to it. And in fact, when The House is Black showed at the New York Film Festival, the review, it wasn't really reviewed. It was like there was a review of Taste of Cherry that said, oh, and by the way, it's shown with a film about a leper colony, but it made it seem like it was a totally, it was unpleasant and not of any great consequence. It was just, a film about a leper colony, period, And so I think even though it might have had an impact showing at the New York Film Festival, it wasn't an impact that the New York Times was ready to acknowledge or ready to deal with. These things come gradually, but Marnaz and I were very gratified to find when Sight and Sound did a poll on the greatest documentaries, it wound up on the, I guess, top 15 or 20 list, which, where it wouldn't have been there at all, beforehand. So sometimes, things that weren't culture, people weren't ready for, when they came out or they catch up with. And it happens. Sometimes it's also about availability too. It's always based on mysterious circumstances. So it becomes kind of nonsensical when the industry pretends that this can all be scientific, like test marketing and all of this. Because if it were so scientific, they wouldn't get it wrong so often. They wouldn't make wrong guesses and spend all this money on test marketing things, and they still fail. It seems to me that what makes a film success or a failure is made up of mysterious qualities, always.
But there's a lot of coincidences too. Like House is Black not only was censored by Shah's regime, but also Golestan was sitting on it. he did not want the film to be, he had a copy of the film and he said he did not have. So we had to go to Cinémathèque Française to get a copy of the film.
Yes, not only that, he also criticized the subtitles that we worked on. But then when we looked at the kind of like the ones that he said that were perfect, that there were all sorts of, large sections of the narration that weren't translated at all in the version that he said was perfect. So, it's like everybody has their own biases,
A lot of films that are good films in any time in Iran. Like recently I learned about the film by Mohammad Reza Aslani, Shatranj Bad. How did they translate it? Winchester, something like that. I said, okay, extraordinary film, but it just happened that one of his relative or somebody found it in a, I don't know, somewhere, a garage of somebody, and it was brought to attention, and then the film got restored and was shown, and then for the first time, after so many 60 years, 57 years, and it's a it's a great film. So it is some coincidences that suddenly a film become accessible. It is important that a festival or an outlet that is international shows the film, and it is important that some important critics also write about it. It's all that, and of course the audience would respond to the film. Yeah.
Well, one thing I can add about this, it's kind of, I think, interesting, is that one of the things that it seems to me is distinctive about Iranian cinema to Western audiences is that it's the most humanistic cinema, that it's humanistic in the way that Italian neorealism was, except even maybe more so. And it's something that, connects the House is Black with Kiarostami's films, with Makhmalbaf's films, that there's a certain kind of humanism. However, if you look at Kiarostami's films, almost all of them are autocritiques of some kind or another. Films that are basically criticizing his elitist view of poor people, and his manipulation of poor people even. That embedded in the films is not only implied, but it's even direct criticism of, like the heroes or the privileged characters in these films. And that's something that the international audience sometimes has more trouble dealing with, because how on the one hand can you have a film that's superhumanistic, and on the other hand, criticizing the whole means of conveying that humanism? It's sort of like, it's like a dialectic almost, between the humanism and something that criticizes the whole position, because so much of his films are about class too, about interaction between people of separate classes. And that's that's also true of films that he wrote but didn't direct, like Crimson Gold, for example, is certainly very much about that. And that becomes a whole issue too. In other words, to what extent do we respond to Crimson Gold as a film about class? To what extent is it just being seen by a Western audience as a film about Iran and not a film about class? There are all kinds of different ways of reading these films, and some are very often the way they're treated tells us more about the viewers than it tells us about the film in a certain sense. I don't think we're in a position to know, because the funny thing is, I'm always suspicious of anybody who says the films of a given year are good or bad. You only can answer that question if you then say good or bad for whom, good or bad for what, and then it's still based on what films you've been able to see. And then there are all these films you haven't been able to see. So how can we judge? In other words, if we say that the films of a given year are good or bad, that means that we trust the people who decide what films we see. And why should we trust their judgment? Everybody's fallible. So it just seems to me that there's a lot of arrogance in the way that we sort of feel like we know what the status of Iranian cinema in a given period. I mean, the people who determine what Iranian cinema is aren't people who see all of the films, even. And, there are films that don't pass the censor, and there are films, that get made and don't get released. So I saw an amazing film when I was in Iran teaching. In fact, the only thing that the school imposed on my teaching was 2 screenings of films that had been banned. And this is like a state-run institution that still was sufficiently anti-government to include in his curriculum of my course 2 films that were banned, one of which has now become available, although it hasn't had many screenings in this country. But it seems to me that given all of those circumstances, we're not in a position to know what Iranian cinema is at any given period, unless we sort of describe it as being the films that the censor agrees to pass and that audiences agree to see, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a comprehensive list. It never is. Oh, well, it's so, what constitutes a jury is made up of so many different things, and every jury is different. I've been on a lot of juries, and I don't think one can generalize too much because, so much determines whether a film gets a prize, what it's up against, who's on the jury, and, and that varies from year to year. So I think Where is the Friend's House is an important film. If I had to weigh it against Taste of Cherry, I might rank Taste of Cherry a little bit higher, but I don't know if it really matters. And I think there are plenty of legitimate ways that one can prefer the other film, I think in other words, it depends again, good for whom and good for what. As a landscape film, Where's the Friend's House is more important than Taste of Cherry. But if people are not necessarily judging it as a landscape film. It's so it all depends.
I think that what we are getting into, but we shouldn't, because it's the end of our time, is the definition of national cinema, which is always tricky, and what becomes defines a cinema, under nationality. But the expectation of the audience is a very interesting thing that is created by the whole culture of global culture of cinema. So I got a call from somebody who wanted to make a film, and he called me and said, I want a film in the genre of Iranian cinema. I didn't know what to even say. The Iranian cinema is not a genre, but it's the expectation of the audience that certain type of films, certain type of style, certain type of subject, it becomes sort of a stereotype again. So it's the same thing happens with the Chinese film and Indian film, all over. It's the expectation. So, I think I like the films that, break that expectation and confront the audience with their own expectation.
If somebody asked us, what is American cinema? I think we'd begin to know the whole complications of defining a national cinema. Because, you could think of contradictory definitions of American cinema that contradict one another very easily. And similarly, one could do that for almost any national cinema. It depends on what one sees, There are a certain group of people for whom a French film is a silly comedy, and then for other people for whom a French film is a new wave film, or still others who think of it as a kind of French neorealism. I mean, it all depends on what one's seen, and nobody's seen everything, right? So one of the differences between film culture today and film culture in the 60s is back in the 60s, people pretended to be able to sort of judge and make statements about all of cinema. It was a false assumption because things like Iranian cinema weren't even considered worthy of consideration. It was out of the running. And many other national cinemas, Chinese cinema too in the West. But today we know that we don't know enough. So that's the beginning of knowledge when we start to understand our own ignorance. And I think that's when it comes to definitions of national cinema, we always have to start with our ignorance, I think.